Picture a parking lot in Thunder Bay, Ontario. January, 4:17 in the morning. The wind coming off Lake Superior has been moving over ice for 600 miles, and by the time it reaches this strip of cracked asphalt behind a shuttered Canadian Tire, it carries an edge that cuts through denim in seconds. 7 people are dying out here tonight. They don't know it yet. They're tucked into sleeping bags, curled against dumpsters, breathing the thin vapor of their own survival. The official overnight low is -41 Celsius. With the wind, it's -57. Near the loading bay, on a patch of ground that used to be a delivery ramp, there's a shape. Low, dark, no bigger than a child's pup tent. If you walked past it in the dark, you'd think it was a pile of trash bags. It's not. Inside that shape, a 58-year-old woman named Mireille Beauchamp is asleep. Not shivering, not half frozen. Asleep. Beneath her, a thermometer she salvaged from a broken aquarium reads 26 degrees Celsius, 79 Fahrenheit, room temperature. Outside her tent, -57. Inside her tent, +79, a difference of 136 degrees, separated by a thin blue plastic sheet. For 9 months, the people in her camp had called her tent Le Petit Cercueil, the little coffin. They laughed at it. They told her she'd freeze before Christmas. One man offered to bet her a bottle of rye she wouldn't last a week. He's not laughing tonight. He's in a hospital in Thunder Bay with the first 2 joints of 3 fingers missing. Mireille is asleep. To understand how a $14 blue tarp kept one woman warmer than a house, while 7 of her neighbors fought for their lives, we have to rewind 9 months, back to a spring morning in April, when Mireille sat down on an overturned milk crate and did something almost nobody in her situation thinks to do. She opened a notebook, and she started to design. You have to understand what it means to be 58 years old and homeless in a city that freezes for 8 months a year. It means you've already survived something. Nobody arrives here accidentally at 58. You arrive carrying the wreckage of whatever came before, a husband who left, a son who overdosed, a pension that evaporated in a lawyer's office, a rented room that was sold out from under you because the landlord's nephew wanted it. Mireille had 3 of those 4. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that by the April when this story begins, she'd been outside for 14 months, and she'd watched 2 winters from the wrong side of a sleeping bag. The first winter she'd survived by luck. The second had nearly killed her. She'd woken up one February morning in a shelter cot with frostbite on her left earlobe and a cough she couldn't shake for 3 weeks. The nurse at the walk-in clinic, a young woman with a name tag that said Priya, had looked at Mireille's chart and said very quietly, "Madam, if you go back out there for another winter, you will not come back." Mireille had nodded, and then she'd gone back out there, because there was nowhere else to go. But something had shifted that day in the clinic. Something small. Before, she'd been a woman trying to survive winter. After, she was a woman trying to understand winter. There's a difference. The first is a prayer. The second is a project. She started the notebook the next week. It was a child's exercise book. Red cover, 32 pages of lined paper. She'd found it in a donation bin outside a church. The first page had a half-finished spelling lesson in a child's wobbly hand. The cat is on the mat. The cat is on the... And then, nothing. Mireille turned to page 2. At the top, she wrote a single word. Chaleur. Heat. And underneath it, a question that had been forming in her for months, ever since she'd watched her own breath freeze into little white feathers on the inside of her sleeping bag. Where does it go? That question is the whole story. Everything that happens over the next 9 months, the mockery, the engineering, the blizzard, the 7 hospitalizations, the one woman who slept warm, all of it is the working out of that 4-word sentence. Where does the heat go? Here's what most people believe about the cold. They believe cold is a thing, a substance, almost, that comes in and attacks you. You put on more clothes to stop the cold from getting in. You close the windows to keep the cold out. The language of winter is the language of invasion, but cold isn't a thing. Cold is what the world feels like when your heat has gone somewhere else. Your body is a small furnace. Every second you're alive, you're burning about 100 watts of chemical energy, roughly the output of an old incandescent light bulb. That heat doesn't stay. It leaves. It radiates off your skin as infrared light. It convects into the air and rides the wind away. It conducts through whatever you're touching, the ground, a wall, a spoon, and disappears into the mass of the world. It evaporates through your breath and your sweat in packets of hot water vapor. 4 exits, that's all the heat has: radiation, convection, conduction, evaporation. And this is what Mireille wrote on page 3 of her red notebook, in careful block letters, on an April afternoon behind a closed Canadian Tire. 4 doors, close all 4, most shelters, most clothes, most tents, most houses, only closed 2 or 3. The sleeping bag she'd been given by the church closed convection and conduction fairly well, but it leaked radiation, and every breath she exhaled inside it filled it down with moisture, which evaporated against her skin all night, pulling warmth out of her the same way a swamp cooler cools a living room in July. She'd been sleeping, without knowing it, inside an air conditioner. Close all 4. That was the design brief. Everything that came after was engineering. You should meet the camp before the tent gets built, because the tent doesn't mean anything without the people who laughed at it. There were, at the peak that summer, about 23 people living in the cluster of shelters behind the shuttered big-box stores on the east side of Thunder Bay. It wasn't a formal encampment. It had just happened. Somebody had set up a tent, and then somebody else, and by June there was a loose village of tarps and pup tents, and one old camper shell propped up on cinder blocks. The patriarch of the place, if you can call it that, was a man named Donald, 61, former millwright from the paper mill that closed in 2009. Bad back, worse liver. He had a kind of gruff authority that came from having been there the longest, almost 4 years. Donald had a big army surplus tent, a propane heater he used carefully, and 2 sleeping bags layered inside each other. He had, by the standards of the camp, survived well. When Mireille showed up in April with her red notebook and her questions, Donald was the first person she talked to. "What keeps you warm at night?" He looked at her like she'd asked him what kept water wet. "Sleeping bag, heater, rye, and when it hits -30, then you use 2 sleeping bags and pray. And when you pray, does it work?" Donald had looked at her for a long moment. Then he barked out a laugh without humor and said, "Lady, everybody prays. The ones still here are the ones who prayed loudest." Mireille had written that down in the notebook. Not because it was wisdom, because it was the thing she was trying to escape. Here's what Donald and the other 22 people in the camp didn't know, and what Mireille spent the next 4 months teaching herself from physics textbooks she read in the public library on Algoma Street, sitting at a corner table where nobody bothered her. A human being at rest radiates about 80 to 100 watts of infrared energy, outward in every direction. That's a measurable, predictable number. It doesn't change much whether you're in Thunder Bay or Tahiti. Your body is a small heat lamp. If you're inside a heated house, those watts don't matter. The room around you is almost as warm as you are, so it radiates almost as much heat back at you as you radiated it. The net loss is small. But if you're inside a cold tent at -30, the walls of the tent are almost as cold as the sky. They absorb your radiation and give nothing back. Every second, you're bleeding 80 watts of invisible light into fabric that might as well be outer space. Now here's the part Mireille underlined 3 times in her notebook. A sheet of aluminum foil reflects about 97% of infrared radiation. 97%, which means that if you put a layer of foil, or something like foil, between your body and the cold wall of the tent, your own heat bounces back at you. You become your own heater. You don't need fuel. You don't need a battery. You don't need to pray. You just need a surface that won't let your light escape. This is the principle, by the way, that keeps astronauts from cooking on one side and freezing on the other in the vacuum of space. The shiny gold foil on spacecraft isn't decoration. It's the most important insulation ever invented. It's the reason the James Webb Telescope can stare into the coldest corners of the universe without its own warmth fogging up the picture. At a Dollarama in Thunder Bay, A roll of emergency blanket foil costs about $4.25, big enough to line a coffin. Mireille bought 3 rolls. When she carried them back to the camp, Donald saw her and whistled. Going to bake a turkey? No. Decorating for Christmas? No. What, then? And she told him, in simple words, 4 doors, radiation, reflection, the physics of a shiny surface. She was, remember, 58 years old. She had, before all of this went wrong, worked for 22 years in the accounting department of a forestry company. She had a brain that liked numbers and columns and things that added up. The physics made sense to her because physics is, at the end of the day, a form of accounting. Heat in, heat out. Balance the ledger. Donald listened. Then he laughed that single bark again. Lady, you're going to freeze to death inside a chip bag. The people standing around laughed too. Not cruelly. Just the way people laugh when someone suggests something that violates their whole understanding of how the world works. Sleeping bags keep you warm. Heaters keep you warm. Alcohol feels like it keeps you warm. Tarps and tinfoil are what you use when you've given up. They called her tent when it started to take shape in late August. Le petit cercueil. The little coffin, because it was small and dark and low to the ground, and it looked, from the outside, like something you'd be buried in. Mireille didn't argue. She just kept building. Late August. The air still warm from the day. Mireille is on her knees with a measuring tape. She's found her spot. It matters where you put a shelter, and she's thought about this for a month. Not under a tree, because trees drip condensation and drop branches in ice storms. Not against a wall, because walls channel wind into corners. Not on bare asphalt, because asphalt conducts heat out of you like a cold skillet. She's chosen a patch of packed dirt in the lee of the old loading dock, protected from the northwest wind by the building, drained on a slight slope away from her door, invisible from the road. The tent is not one thing. This is the first secret. Every shelter in the camp is one thing. A bag, a tarp, a tent. Mireille's is 4 things, layered one inside the other, each closing one of the 4 doors. The outermost layer is a single blue polyethylene tarp, 8 feet by 10, the kind you can buy at any hardware store for under $15. She's bought 2, with money from bottle returns and 1 week of panhandling outside a liquor store where she was frankly terrible at it. She hates asking for money. She's good at arithmetic and bad at shame. She stretches the first tarp over a low A-frame made from 3 saplings she's cut from the edge of the lot. Green wood, because green wood bends without snapping. The peak is low, just high enough for her to sit up inside. The footprint is narrow, just wide enough for her body and about a foot of space on either side. Why low? Because every cubic foot of air inside the shelter is air she has to heat with her own body. A big tent is a big refrigerator she has to warm with a birthday candle. A small tent is a phone booth she warms with a match. She's going to be the match. She lashes the tarp down with paracord looped through grommets and tied to bricks she scavenged from a collapsed retaining wall. Not stakes. Bricks. Stakes pull out of frozen ground. Bricks don't care. That's layer 1. Wind stop. Rain stop. Snow stop. It closes most of the convection door. Layer 2 goes underneath, inside the first tarp. It's a second blue tarp, but this one she's modified. She spent 3 evenings at the camp with a roll of silver emergency blanket foil and a bottle of spray adhesive she traded 2 cans of soup for. And she's laminated the entire inside surface of this second tarp with the foil, every square inch. When she's done, the inside of the second tarp looks like the inside of a bag of potato chips. This is the radiation mirror. When she sleeps inside it, her body will radiate infrared light outward in every direction. Without the foil, that light flies through the blue plastic and disappears into the night. With the foil, 97% of it bounces back. Her own heat reflected back onto her own skin. She is, in effect, wrapping herself in a mirror for invisible light. She suspends this inner tarp from the same A-frame using safety pins through the grommets. It hangs about 4 inches inside the outer tarp, leaving a gap between the 2 layers. That gap is the third secret. Air is one of the best insulators in the world. Better than fiberglass. Better than down. Better than almost anything you can buy. But only if it doesn't move. Moving air is just the wind. And the wind is a thief. Still air is a wall. The 4-inch gap between Mireille's outer tarp and her inner foiled tarp is a pocket of trapped, still air. The outer tarp reflects her heat, and the sealed pocket between them is the insulation. That's the coat. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't weigh anything. It's just air that can't go anywhere. This is the principle, though she doesn't know the history, that kept Ernest Shackleton's men alive for 20 months on Elephant Island in 1916. They flipped 2 lifeboats upside down, packed snow against the gunwales, and lived in the trapped air pocket underneath. Every mountaineer who has ever dug a snow cave instead of pitching a tent has survived on this principle. Trapped air, properly layered, is warmer than wool. Mireille has reinvented it from scratch behind a Canadian tire with a notebook and a library card. Layer 3 is the floor. This is, for most homeless people in cold climates, the door through which they die. You can insulate your sides all you want. If you lie directly on frozen ground, that ground will suck heat out of your body at a rate your metabolism cannot replace. It's called conductive heat loss, and it's the reason that sleeping on cold ground with a thick sleeping bag can still kill you, while sleeping on a thick foam pad with a thin blanket might not. Mireille has built her floor in 4 layers. Bottom, a sheet of cardboard 3 layers thick, lifted off the dirt by a frame of scavenged 2x4s that raises it about 3 inches off the ground. The 3 inches of air underneath is another insulating pocket. Middle, a layer of dry leaves she's gathered from a park, sealed inside 2 garbage bags that she's taped shut. Leaves trap air the way down traps air. A garbage bag full of dry leaves is a synthetic goose. Then, a yoga mat she found at a Goodwill for $2.75. Then, an old wool blanket doubled. The whole stack is about 8 inches thick. It is, for the purposes of conduction, a wall of foam between her body and the planet. Layer 4 is her body and its immediate envelope. 2 sleeping bags, one inside the other. She bought the outer one at a rummage sale for $15, and the inner one was given to her by a woman at the shelter who was moving to British Columbia. A wool hat, because up to 1/3 of your heat escapes from your head when you sleep. 2 pairs of wool socks, a bandana tied loosely over her mouth and nose. That last one is the 4th door, evaporation. Every breath you exhale contains about a cubic centimeter of water vapor, heated to body temperature. When that vapor leaves your face into cold air, it carries a huge amount of heat with it, heat of vaporization, in the textbooks. About 540 calories per gram. Over 8 hours of sleep, an average adult breathes out about 300 milliliters of water. That's a half pint of hot water you're pouring into the night air. The bandana doesn't stop this. Nothing short of a sealed mask could. But the bandana warms the incoming air slightly before it reaches her lungs, and it catches a fraction of the outgoing moisture, rebreathing it on the next inhale. It's a crude nose-and-mouth exchanger. It reduces the bleed. In the engineering of survival, every reduction is a gift. She finishes the tent on September 2nd. It takes her, in total, about 47 hours of work over the course of 6 weeks, and it costs, she's written the exact figure on the last page of the red notebook, $82.16 Canadian. $82 for a shelter that will, in January, keep her 136 degrees warmer than the world. The camp, of course, does not understand what they're looking at. They see the blue tarps. They see the shape, low and strange. They don't see the mirrors inside, or the air gaps, or the leaf insulation, or the stacked floor. They see a woman who has spent her whole summer building what looks, to their eyes, like the world's most pathetic pup tent. Donald walks by on the day she moves in. He shakes his head slowly. "Madam," he says, "I hope you said your prayers." Mireille, kneeling in the doorway of her little coffin, doesn't answer. She just smiles. She has not prayed once in 6 weeks. She has calculated. September into October, the first cold nights come in the 3rd week of September. A frost on the grass, a skin of ice on the puddles at dawn. The camp shivers. Mireille sleeps. She keeps records. This is important. Every morning she writes in the notebook. Outside temperature from a cheap thermometer she's taped to the outside of her tent. Inside temperature from the aquarium thermometer. Quality of sleep on a scale of 1 to 5. Any condensation inside the shelter. Any problems. On October 4th, the first real hard freeze, -9 Celsius. Outside, inside her tent, +14. A 23-degree gap heated only by her own body. She sleeps for 9 hours without waking. On October 19th, an early snow, 3 inches. She wakes up to find the outer tarp sagging slightly under the weight. She knocks it off from the inside with the handle of a broom. The snow actually helps. It's another insulating layer, trapping more still air against her walls. Igloos work on exactly this principle. Her tent has become, briefly, an igloo with a blue plastic bone structure. On November 11th, Remembrance Day, -16 outside, +19 inside. The gap is 35 degrees. She writes in her notebook in French. Le cercueil respire. The coffin breathes. The camp has started to notice. Not everyone. Donald still laughs. A few of the younger men still mock her when she walks past. But some of the others, especially the women, and especially one woman named Faye, who is 44 and has been outside for only 8 months and is visibly afraid, have begun to stand near her tent in the evenings and ask questions. Not many, just 1 or 2. How does it stay warm in there? What's inside? Mireille is careful in her answers. Not secretive. Careful, because what she has built is not just a tent, it is a system. And the system only works if you understand the whole of it. A person who copies only the blue tarps will freeze. A person who copies only the foil will freeze. A person who copies only the raised floor will freeze. The magic is in the layering, and the layering has to be done right, so she explains, when asked. Slowly, with the notebook open, she draws diagrams for Faye on a page torn from the back. She explains the 4 doors. She describes the 4-inch gap. She tells Faye that if she can find $20, she can start her own build, and Mireille will help. Faye says she'll think about it. She doesn't. Not yet. There's a kind of inertia that settles into a person after a few months outside, a sense that this is just how it is, that the cold is the cold, that there's nothing to be done but endure. Faye nods at Mireille's diagrams and then goes back to her own tent, which is a 3-season dome from Canadian Tire that is going to fail catastrophically the first week of December. This is the saddest thing about the whole story. Not the laughter, not the cold, the fact that even when the information was free, even when the woman with the answer was sitting right there with her notebook open, most of the camp couldn't hear it. Because to hear it, they'd have had to first admit that the way they'd been surviving was wrong. And admitting you've been wrong about the thing that's been slowly killing you is harder than freezing. Mireille knows this. She was that person for 14 months before the nurse named Priya looked at her chart. She doesn't push. She just keeps her thermometer records. December comes. The temperatures drop. The camp thins. 2 people leave for the shelter downtown, which has opened its cold weather beds. 3 people disappear. No one knows where. This is normal. People come and go. One man is found dead in his sleeping bag on December 8th, of what the coroner will later call environmental exposure, compounded by acute alcohol poisoning. Donald tells everyone that the man died because he drank too much rye. The truth is closer to the reverse. He drank too much rye because he was freezing, and the alcohol, which actually cools the body by dilating surface blood vessels, finished what the cold had started. Mireille attends the small memorial the camp holds by the dumpsters. She brings a thermos of hot water she's heated inside her tent over a single tea candle, which in her enclosed space raises the temperature by another 4 degrees without any meaningful fire risk. She passes the thermos around. People drink. Donald takes a sip, looks at her. Still alive in your chip bag, eh? Still alive. Cold's coming. I know. Real cold. I know, Donald. He nods. Something passes over his face that isn't quite respect, but isn't quite mockery either. He hands the thermos back. Good luck, lady. 3 weeks later, he will be in the hospital. January 14th, the forecast for the weekend is what the Weather Network is calling, with no exaggeration, historic. A polar vortex has broken down over northern Manitoba and is sliding southeast. It will collide over Lake Superior with a low-pressure system coming up from the American Midwest. Meteorologists on the news have started using words they don't use often. Generational, lethal, unprecedented since 1982. The Thunder Bay Emergency Shelter has opened every spare cot and has been, since Thursday, turning people away. The warming centers at the libraries and community halls have been full since noon on Friday. The storm hits at 11:14 p.m. on Saturday, January 17th. The wind reaches 93 kilometers an hour by midnight. The temperature, which was -28 at sunset, drops through -30, -35, -40. By 2 a.m. it is -41 Celsius with a wind chill of -57. Exposed skin, a cheek, the back of a hand, freezes in under a minute. Across Thunder Bay, the emergency rooms begin to fill. In the camp behind the Canadian Tire, the wind hits the big Army surplus tent Donald has lived in for 4 years and finds a seam he has been meaning to repair since October. The seam opens, a 10-inch tear. Snow pours in. The propane heater, which he's been running at low flame, is knocked sideways by a gust and extinguishes. In seconds, the inside of his tent goes from merely cold to actively killing him. He is 61 years old. His circulation is bad. He has been drinking, not heavily tonight, but enough. His sleeping bags are layered, but they are synthetic and old, and the loft has compressed over the years. In the first hour after his heater goes out, his core body temperature drops 2 degrees. He is dying. He doesn't fully know it. Hypothermia does this. It steals your awareness of hypothermia. The technical name for what he is beginning to feel, the strange warmth, the urge to take off his jacket, the calm, is paradoxical undressing, and it is a sign that you are about 40 minutes from death. He does not take off his jacket. Not quite. He has one clear thought left, and it is this: the lady with the tarp. He crawls out of his tent into the blizzard. Here is what is happening at exactly this moment inside Le Petit Cercueil. Mireille is asleep. She has been for 3 hours. The tea candle she lit at 9 p.m., which raised the air temperature of the enclosed space to 28 degrees Celsius, has burned down to a puddle and gone out, and she hasn't noticed, because the shelter, sealed, layered, mirrored, is holding its heat the way a thermos holds coffee. The outer tarp is drifted over with snow, 18 inches of it. The snow is acting, exactly as it did in October, as additional insulation. The 4-inch air gap is holding still. The foil layer is doing what foil layers do, bouncing her 100 watts of infrared radiation back at her body. The stacked floor is refusing to conduct. The bandana over her face is warming each inhale and catching a fraction of each exhale. Her body is burning about 90 watts. The shelter is losing about 90 watts. It is, in thermodynamic terms, at equilibrium. She is heating a phone booth-sized space with a light bulb, and the space is so well sealed that it is warmer than most people's bedrooms. 26 degrees Celsius, 79 Fahrenheit. Outside, -57. She is at this moment the warmest person for 3 square blocks who isn't inside a heated building. There is a scratching at the door of her tent. She wakes up. Not with alarm, she is, even in winter, sleeping better than she has in 3 years, and her instincts are calm. She listens. The scratching comes again, and then a voice, hoarse and broken by the wind. Madame Beauchamp, it's Donald. She unzips the inner layer, then the outer. A blast of -50 air hits her face. She sees him on his knees in the snow, his face white, his eyes wet and unfocused. She does not hesitate. She grabs the front of his jacket and pulls him inside her tent and zips both layers shut behind him. The inside of the shelter, which had been a perfect phone booth of warmth, loses about 6 degrees in the 30 seconds the door is open. It is still 20 degrees Celsius inside. It is still 77 degrees warmer than outside. Donald is too big to lie down properly. They sit, knee to knee, in the small space. Mireille takes off her own wool hat and puts it on his head. She takes one of her 2 sleeping bags and wraps it around his shoulders. She pours him a thermos cup of lukewarm water. She keeps a thermos, insulated by a foam sleeve, inside the shelter overnight, because cold water stays liquid at these temperatures only inside her tent, and holds it to his lips until he can drink. He drinks. He starts to shake, hard, full-body shivering, the kind that hurts. This is a good sign. Shivering means his body has re-engaged. Shivering means he's coming back. The dead don't shiver. He looks at her. His eyes focus. He looks at the inside of her shelter. The silver foil walls, the stacked floor, the thermometer reading 20, the candle stub, the red notebook tucked into a pocket of the inner tarp. He starts to cry. He says, in a voice that sounds like it's coming through gravel, "I'm sorry." Mireille doesn't say anything. She just holds the cup. They will sit together like that for 6 hours. Outside, the storm will peak at 3:40 a.m. and then slowly weaken. By dawn, the wind will be down to 30 kilometers an hour. The sun will come up on a city that has lost, according to the final count, 11 people to cold overnight. 7 from the camps, 4 from individual encounters, an elderly man whose car broke down, a teenager who fell asleep on a bus bench, 2 who were evicted from apartments without heat and tried to walk to a shelter. Of the 7 from the camps, 6 are hospitalized, 1 is dead. Faye, the woman Mireille drew diagrams for in November, is one of the hospitalized. She has lost 2 toes on her left foot. She will keep the rest. Donald, in Mireille's tent, survives with frostbite on 3 fingers of his right hand. The fingers will be partially amputated at the first 2 joints. He will, for the rest of his life, have trouble holding a coffee cup. He will also, for the rest of his life, carry a photograph in his wallet of a red notebook and a handwritten page that reads, in careful block letters, 4 doors, close all 4. Let's pull back. The specifics of one woman's tent in one parking lot are not, ultimately, the point. The point is that Mireille Beauchamp, with no engineering training, no money to speak of, and no tools more advanced than a pair of scissors and a measuring tape, built a shelter that outperformed a heated army surplus tent with a propane heater by a margin of more than 100 degrees. How? She did it by understanding in her bones a truth that most of us, including most people with heated houses, have never been taught. Warmth is not something you add. Warmth is something you stop losing. The furnace in your house works because your walls keep the heat from escaping. Take away the walls, and the furnace is useless. You need the output of a small power plant to keep even a single room warm in open air. The insulation is what matters. The furnace is just replacing what the insulation can't quite hold. A human body at 90 watts is its own small furnace. In a well-enough designed shelter, it can heat a small space to habitable temperatures, in any weather, anywhere on Earth, without any external fuel. This is not a trick or a marginal improvement. This is the basic physics of a human being. We just don't build shelters that let our bodies do it. Consider Donald's tent, which failed. Army surplus, canvas, single wall, tall enough to stand in, big enough for a cot and a heater and a chair, 2 sleeping bags inside, a propane heater running low all night. Why did it fail? Because every one of Donald's design choices traded survivability for comfort, and the trade-off is not symmetrical when the temperature drops far enough. Tall enough to stand in means a cubic volume of 1,200 liters of air that must be heated. His body can't heat that. The heater can, but the heater fails if it tips over, and in 90-kilometer winds, things tip over. Single wall means no air gap. His heat, once produced, bleeds through the canvas in 15 minutes. No reflective layer means his infrared radiation goes straight through the wall and into the night. No raised insulated floor means he's in conductive contact with the planet. Earth is a heat sink the size of a planet. You will not win that argument. The propane heater is a bandage over all of these wounds. When it goes out, the wounds are still there, and they kill you. Consider Mireille's tent, which succeeded, small enough to heat with a body, about 200 liters of internal volume, 6 times less air than Donald had. Her 90 watts in her space is like a furnace in a closet, double-walled with a 4-inch air gap. That air gap has an insulating value of roughly R4, about the same as an inch of fiberglass bat. Not a lot, but enough combined with everything else. Foil-lined inner wall. This is the biggest single factor. The foil alone cuts her radiative heat loss by more than 90%. She is, in effect, wearing the tent as a thermal mirror. Raised, layered floor. The cardboard leaf yoga mat wool stack gives her floor an insulating value close to R12. That's better than the walls of most people's houses. Conductive loss, nearly zero. And the bandana over her face, a reduction, not a solution. But every watt saved is a watt she doesn't have to produce. The whole thing, and this is the part people miss, is small. Smallness is not a compromise. Smallness is the strategy. Smallness is what makes 90 watts sufficient. There is a phrase from the Arctic expedition literature that captures what Mireille understood instinctively. It's from Vilhjalmur Stefansson, writing in the 1920s about the Inuit shelters he'd lived in. He said, "The warm igloo is not a paradox, it is the correct solution." An igloo, properly built, will stay at around 0 degrees Celsius inside, even when the air outside is -50. Your body, radiating its 100 watts, will warm the air near your face to 15 or 20 degrees. You sleep in what is effectively a cool spring day inside a wall of ice, heated by nothing but yourself. The principle is the same. Trapped still air, reflective interior, raised floor, small volume, closed envelope. Igloo or tarp tent. The physics doesn't care what the walls are made of. Mireille had reinvented the Inuit shelter using materials from a Canadian tire and a Dollarama. She didn't know this, but the Arctic did. The morning after? January 18th, 9:20 a.m. The sun is up, pale and distant over a city that has stopped. The buses aren't running. The schools are closed. Power is out in 3 neighborhoods. Ambulances have been moving all night, and some of them are still moving, carrying the last of the hospitalized in from the edges of the city. In the parking lot behind the Canadian Tire, Mireille unzips her tent for the second time. The snow has drifted waist-deep against the loading dock. The other tents in the camp are either collapsed, buried, or empty, their occupants evacuated by the emergency response teams that swept through at dawn. Someone from the city, a woman in an orange jacket with a clipboard, is moving through the ruins counting bodies. She sees Mireille emerge from the tent. She sees Donald behind her, wrapped in a sleeping bag, shivering hard but alive. She radios something into her shoulder. 20 minutes later, paramedics arrive. They take Donald first. He goes without protest, looking back once at the blue tent before they load him into the ambulance. The paramedics offer Mireille a ride too. She says politely that she's fine. They ask again. She says politely that she's fine. They look at her thermometer, which is in her hand. They look at the inside of her tent. They don't ask a third time. Before they leave, one of the paramedics, a woman, late 30s, name tag Jensen, kneels in the snow next to Mireille. "Madame," she says, "the ERs are full. The warming centers are over capacity. We have nowhere to put people tonight. Are you really saying you're going to stay here?" Mireille thinks about it. Then she says, "I built this for -50. It's -28 now. I'm safer here than in a hallway." Jensen looks at her for a long moment. Then she takes out a small notebook of her own, the kind paramedics carry, and she says, "Can I ask how you built it?" Mireille talks for 23 minutes. She shows Jensen the foil walls. She shows her the 4-inch gap. She explains the 4 doors. She walks her through the floor, layer by layer. She reads out her temperature records from the red notebook. October 4th, November 11th, December 8th, January 14th. Last night. Jensen writes it all down. When Mireille is finished, Jensen closes her notebook and stands up and brushes the snow off her knees. She looks at the blue tent. She looks at the ruined camp around it. She looks at Mireille. She says, "I've been doing this for 11 years. I've never seen anyone do what you did." Mireille shrugs. "I read books." Jensen nods slowly. Then she says the thing that will matter more than any of it, the thing that will, indirectly, change dozens of lives over the next 2 winters, and, in a small way, change the way the city of Thunder Bay approaches its homeless population during cold snaps. She says, Would you teach other people? Mireille will say yes. It will take her a while. She will require, before she agrees, that the city provide materials for anyone she teaches, because the knowledge is free. But the tarps and foil and cardboard and paracord are not, and she is not going to teach people how to survive using things they cannot afford. The city will say yes too. Not immediately, not at the top, but Jensen will mention it to her supervisor, and her supervisor will mention it to someone at the regional health authority, and by the following autumn, there will be a small program, unofficial, underfunded, half-volunteer, that builds, every fall, about 40 of what the program calls, with affection, Beauchamp shelters. The red notebook by then will have been photocopied. The diagrams will have been redrawn by a volunteer with a design background into cleaner schematics. The 4 doors principle will be written at the top of every instruction sheet. Mireille will, eventually, be housed. It will take another 18 months. It will happen not because of the shelters, but because a woman at a church who heard about the story pushed a housing application through a process that usually moves like molasses. Mireille will move into a small apartment on Algoma Street, above a bakery, with a window that faces east. She will keep the red notebook on her kitchen table for the rest of her life. Donald will visit her, sometimes, when his hand is bothering him. He will sit at her kitchen table and drink tea, not rye, and he will sometimes stare at the notebook for long minutes without opening it. One time he will say quietly, "I almost let you die that first winter, because I laughed," and Mireille, who was not sentimental, will say, "You didn't laugh me to death, Donald. You laughed at the tent. There's a difference." And he'll nod, and they'll sit together in the warm apartment above the bakery with the east-facing window. Take a step back. This is not, really, a story about one homeless woman in one Canadian city. It's a story about how humans understand warmth. Most of us, in heated buildings, have no relationship with our own body heat. We don't think of ourselves as small furnaces. We think of ourselves as creatures who require warmth to be delivered from outside, by furnaces, boilers, utility companies, the grid. Warmth, to us, is a service. But a human body has generated its own warmth for as long as there have been human bodies. The Inuit knew. The Sami of Lapland knew. The herders of the Mongolian steppe knew. Every culture that ever lived in a cold place knew, because they had to. Trapped air, reflective surfaces, raised floors, small volumes, closed envelopes. The same 5 principles, everywhere the winter was long. We've forgotten because we haven't had to remember. And then, in the margins of wealthy cities, the parking lots, the ravines, the lots behind the shuttered stores, we've built populations of people who do have to remember. We've handed them sleeping bags and sent them out to rediscover, painfully and often fatally, what every pre-industrial culture learned by the age of 10. Mireille's story isn't exceptional because she invented something new. It's exceptional because she relearned something old in a place that had erased the knowledge, and she wrote it down in a red notebook so the knowledge could be learned again by the next person. And the next. We could build for $82 per person shelters that work in -50 weather. We don't. Not because we don't know how. Mireille wrote it in a notebook. The physics is in a textbook. The materials are at the hardware store. We don't because we've decided, quietly, that the people sleeping outside aren't worth $82 of our attention. That's not a physics problem. That's a mirror problem. The blue tarp tent behind the Canadian Tire stayed standing through the rest of that January and all of February and most of March. Mireille slept in it every night until she moved into the apartment above the bakery. On the day she moved out, she took the tent down carefully. She coiled the paracord. She folded the tarps. She stacked the cardboard. She bagged the leaves. They were, by then, compressed into a strange papery mass that smelled faintly of autumn. She carried it all, in 3 trips, to the loading dock of a community center that had agreed to store it. A volunteer named Amrita helped her with the last trip. When they were finished, Amrita looked at the pile of materials, the tarps, the foil, the cardboard, the paracord, and she shook her head and laughed, not unkindly. "That's it?" Amrita said. "That's the famous tent? It looks like garbage." And Mireille, who was 59 years old by then, who had a warm apartment above a bakery, who had stopped counting the days since the blizzard because she no longer needed to. Mireille smiled. She said, "It looks like garbage because we'd been taught that warmth comes from expensive things. A furnace, a wall, a house. We are taught to look at warmth and see money." She paused, looked at the pile, looked at Amrita. But warmth is just heat that hasn't left yet. And heat doesn't know how much you paid for the thing that's holding it. 4 doors. That's all there is. That's all there ever was. A body that makes heat. A space that holds it. A mirror that reflects it. A floor that keeps it. A breath that doesn't waste it. $82. 1 red notebook. 1 woman who, when they laughed, did not laugh back. Who did not argue. Who did not explain. Who just went on very quietly, building the warmest room in Thunder Bay.